November 19, 1942, 0530 hours. Führer Headquarters, Rastenburg, East Prussia. A coded transmission from Army Group B would shatter 18 months of carefully maintained illusions about the war in the East. What German High Command read in that message would force them to confront a truth they had spent the entire Russian campaign denying. The Soviet Union hadn't been on the verge of collapse. It had been getting stronger. The operations room of the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, sat hidden beneath reinforced concrete and camouflage netting in the forests of East Prussia. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the space hummed with the controlled tension of officers managing a war on 3 continents. Chief of the Army General Staff, Kurt Zeitzler's morning briefing had become a ritual of managed optimism, punctuated by occasional setbacks that would be overcome through German tactical superiority. At precisely 0530 hours, Signals Officer Major Ernst Decker burst through the security door carrying a decoded message from General Maximilian von Weichs, commander of Army Group B. His face had the pale, tight look of a man who understood what he was carrying. The message was terse, transmitted from 6th Army Headquarters at Stalingrad before Soviet forces cut communications with forward positions. Soviet forces launched major offensive north and south of Stalingrad. Romanian positions collapsing. Multiple penetrations. Scale unprecedented. Request immediate reinforcement and authorization for tactical withdrawal. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of 6th Army, had added a personal note that would prove prophetic. This is not a local counterattack. This is an operational level encirclement. Without immediate action, entire army at risk. Colonel General Kurt Zeitzler read the transmission twice, his jaw tightening. The mathematics seemed impossible. Soviet forces were supposed to be exhausted, their reserves depleted after 18 months of catastrophic losses. German intelligence had assessed that Stalin had no more than 50 divisions available for operations. The Soviets couldn't possibly be launching a major offensive. But within 3 hours, additional reports arriving from Army Group B told a different story. Radio intercepts indicated at least 12 Soviet armies, perhaps 1,000 men, attacking simultaneously on fronts north and south of Stalingrad. The scales suggested operational planning that German intelligence had insisted the Soviets were incapable of executing. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, stood at the massive situation map covering the Eastern Wall. His staff had become exceptionally skilled at tracking Soviet movements, or so they believed. They knew Soviet doctrine, typical attack patterns, and expected casualty ratios. Nothing in 18 months of Eastern warfare suggested the Soviets could execute the kind of coordinated, multi-front offensive that reports were describing. By 0900 hours, reconnaissance flights over the breakthrough sectors reported something that shattered fundamental assumptions. Soviet forces weren't attacking with desperate infantry charges as expected. They were attacking with massive tank formations, hundreds of T-34s and KV-1s advancing in coordinated waves, supported by artillery barrages that suggested ammunition reserves no one had believed existed. Captain Reinhard Gehlen, head of Foreign Armies East, German military intelligence for the Soviet Union, received reports throughout the morning that made his previous assessments look catastrophically wrong. His latest intelligence summary, delivered just 3 days earlier, had concluded that Soviet offensive capacity was minimal and that enemy reserves are largely exhausted. The morning staff conference convened at 1000 hours with Adolf Hitler presiding. The Führer had moved his headquarters to Rastenburg specifically to manage the Eastern Front, and Stalingrad had become his personal obsession. The city bearing Stalin's name was to be Germany's triumph, proof that German will could overcome any Soviet resistance. "Gentlemen," Zeitzler began, his voice tight, "we are facing a coordinated Soviet offensive of significant scale. Both Romanian armies flanking 6th Army are in full retreat. Soviet mechanized forces have penetrated 15 to 20 kilometers in multiple sectors. Hitler's response was immediate and furious. Romanian weakness. They lack the fighting spirit of German soldiers. Paulus will contain this with his reserves and resume offensive operations within the week. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, attempted to inject reality into the discussion. Mein Führer, the reports suggest this is not a local action. The Soviets appear to be executing a large-scale pincer movement aimed at encircling 6th Army entirely. Hitler's face flushed. The Soviets lack the operational sophistication for such maneuvers. Their officer corps was decimated in the purges. They fight through crude mass and nothing more. Paulus has 250,000 men in Stalingrad. No Soviet force can threaten such strength. The room fell silent. Every officer present had read the morning's intelligence reports. What those reports suggested was not merely a Soviet attack, but a fundamental recalculation of Soviet capabilities. If the Soviets could mass this many forces, coordinate this many armies, and maintain this level of operational security, then every assumption about Red Army capabilities was wrong. By 1400 hours, the situation had deteriorated beyond anyone's morning projections. Soviet mobile forces from the northern pincer, General Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front, had advanced 40 kilometers in less than 9 hours. The southern pincer, General Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad front, had shattered the Romanian 4th Army completely. German reconnaissance reported Soviet tank columns racing westward with what appeared to be a specific objective: meeting behind 6th Army and sealing it inside Stalingrad. Intelligence Officer Captain Galen presented his emergency assessment at 1500 hours. His staff had been calculating Soviet force deployments since the invasion began in June 1941. Their numbers had been consistently wrong, but always in directions that suggested Soviet weakness. Based on radio traffic analysis and prisoner interrogations, Galen reported, voice barely steady, "We now assess that the Soviets deployed approximately 100,000 men, 15,000 artillery pieces, and 1,400 tanks for this operation. These figures exceed our previous estimates of total Soviet reserves by factors of 3 to 4. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, recently appointed to rescue the Southern Front, added what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say, and if they concealed forces of this magnitude for this operation, we must assume they have additional reserves we have not detected. The German understanding of Soviet military capacity had been shaped by a series of carefully constructed beliefs that began long before Operation Barbarossa. These beliefs, documented in countless intelligence summaries and strategic assessments, would all collapse within weeks of November 19th. But to understand what German High Command finally realized, one must first understand what they had convinced themselves was true. In December 1940, when planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union began in earnest, German military intelligence had produced an assessment that would guide all subsequent operations. The document, titled Military Geographic Study of the European USSR, concluded that Soviet forces were poorly led, inadequately equipped, and incapable of sustained resistance against modern combined arms warfare. The assessment was based on Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland, where Red Army forces had suffered catastrophic casualties against a much smaller Finnish force. German observers concluded that Stalin's purges of the officer corps in 1937-1938 had destroyed Soviet military effectiveness. The Red Army, they assessed, was a hollow force that would collapse under sustained German pressure. This assessment led to 3 core assumptions that guided German strategy. First, numerical superiority could be overcome through operational excellence. Yes, the Soviets had more men, more tanks, more aircraft, but German forces, through superior training, doctrine, and leadership, would achieve casualty ratios that made Soviet numbers irrelevant. One German division would be worth 3 Soviet divisions in combat effectiveness. Second, Soviet logistics and industrial capacity were primitive. Germany's industrial superiority would ensure continuous supply of modern weapons while Soviet production collapsed under German bombing and loss of industrial regions. The war would be won before Soviet industrial capacity could matter. Third, Soviet society would collapse under military pressure. The Soviet Union was a ramshackle empire held together by terror. Defeat in battle would trigger political collapse, with occupied populations welcoming German forces as liberators and Soviet leadership imploding in recrimination and purges. These assumptions had been tested extensively in the first 18 months of war in the East, and reality had consistently suggested they were wrong. Yet German High Command had reinterpreted each setback as validation of their theories, needing tactical adjustment rather than fundamental revision. In August 1941, after 2 months of Operation Barbarossa, German forces had destroyed entire Soviet armies, captured millions of prisoners, and advanced hundreds of kilometers. Intelligence assessments concluded that Soviet forces were substantially destroyed and incapable of significant resistance. Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder recorded in his war diary, "It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. But the Soviets hadn't collapsed. Instead, they had mobilized new armies from reserves German intelligence hadn't believed existed." By September 1941, German forces were fighting fresh Soviet units that, according to German assessments, shouldn't have existed. The official explanation blamed faulty intelligence gathering, not the fundamental assumption that Soviet reserves were limited. At Moscow in December 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive that drove German armies back from the capital and inflicted casualties that shocked German leadership. It was the first major German defeat of the war. The official assessment blamed premature winter conditions and overstretched supply lines, not Soviet capability. The underlying assumption that German forces would achieve decisive victory through operational superiority remained intact. At Kharkov in May 1942, German forces had encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies, capturing 240,000 prisoners and hundreds of tanks. Intelligence assessments confidently projected that Soviet offensive capacity was exhausted and that summer operations would achieve the decisive victory that had eluded Germany in 1941. The Stalingrad offensive was planned on the assumption that Soviet forces would collapse once German pressure resumed. By November 19, 1942, every major assumption had been systematically demolished by reality. Yet senior leadership had never formally acknowledged this. Hitler's continued insistence that Stalingrad would fall through willpower represented not madness, but the logical endpoint of beliefs that had never been properly questioned. The afternoon of November 19th marked the first time in the entire Eastern campaign that German High Command confronted their illusions directly. Not through choice, but because Soviet tank columns were racing to cut off their largest army in the field, and no amount of doctrinal confidence could change that physical reality. By 1800 hours on November 19th, the situation had clarified in the most devastating way possible. Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers were converging on Kalash, a small town 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. If they met there, and reconnaissance indicated they would within 48 hours, 6th Army would be completely surrounded. General Paulus transmitted his assessment at 1830 hours, marked most urgent. Army encirclement appears imminent. Romanian armies destroyed. No significant German reserves available for counterattack. Request authorization for immediate breakout to the west, while corridor remains open. Window closing rapidly. The request went directly to Hitler. His response, delivered at 1945 hours, would define everything that followed. 6th Army will hold present positions regardless of enemy action. Fortress Stalingrad will be supplied by air. No retreat. The conference room at Führer headquarters descended into something unprecedented in German military protocol. Open disagreement with a direct Hitler order. General Zeitzler, normally cautious to the point of timidity, spoke with barely controlled fury. Mein Führer, 250,000 men require 500 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe has never sustained such airlift capacity in winter conditions, and you are assuming the pocket can be held. Intelligence suggests Soviet forces will commit additional armies to ensure complete destruction. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made the promise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Luftwaffe can supply Stalingrad by air. I guarantee it. Field Marshal von Manstein, brought from the Leningrad front specifically for his expertise in mobile operations, attempted a different approach. The question is not whether Stalingrad can be held, but whether holding it serves strategic purposes. Sixth Army breaking out preserves a force that can defend a more sustainable line, allowing encirclement risks, losing the army entirely. Hitler's response revealed the psychological foundation that would doom Sixth Army. If we retreat from Stalingrad, the entire front collapses. If German soldiers can be driven from ground we have taken, then all our achievements mean nothing. The Soviets will see weakness and press everywhere. Stalingrad must be held because retreat would prove everything they believe about us. This was the core of it. The refusal to retreat from Stalingrad wasn't based on military calculation. It was based on the belief that German forces, through superior will and tactical skill, could overcome any material disadvantage. To admit that Soviet forces could encircle and destroy a German army was to admit that the fundamental premise of the war, that German superiority could overcome Soviet numbers, was false. By November 23, 1942, the encirclement was complete. Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met at Kalach, sealing 6th Army and elements of 4th Panzer Army inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers east to west. Approximately 290,000 German and Axis forces were trapped. The morning intelligence briefing on November 23 brought information that fundamentally altered German High Command's understanding of who they were fighting. Captain Galen's overnight analysis revealed details about the Soviet operation that suggested planning sophistication German intelligence had consistently denied was possible. The Soviet operation, Galen explained, hands trembling slightly as he held his notes, was named Operation Uranus. Planning began in September. The Soviets massed forces in complete secrecy, moved them at night, maintained radio silence, and executed deception operations that convinced us they were weaker than they actually were. The operation was personally overseen by General Georgy Zhukov, who appears to have coordinated 3 different Soviet fronts, 7 armies, in a level of operational planning that he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like defeatism. That exceeds the sophistication we previously attributed to Soviet command. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel interrupted. You're telling me that the Soviet military, which we assessed as capable only of crude mass attacks, executed an operational-level deception and encirclement that surprised German forces completely? Yes, Herr Feldmarschall. And the implications are... The implications, Colonel General Jodl finished, are that every assessment we've made about Soviet capability has been fundamentally wrong. If they can do this at Stalingrad, they can do it elsewhere. The entire Eastern Front is vulnerable to operations we've assumed they couldn't execute. The conference room fell into silence that stretched for nearly a minute. These were men who had built careers on German military superiority, who had planned the most successful military operations in history, who had conquered France in 6 weeks and Yugoslavia in 11 days. The idea that Soviet forces, depicted in propaganda as subhuman and primitive, could outplan, outmaneuver, and outfight German commanders challenged not just tactical assessments, but their entire understanding of the war. General Paulus, commanding the encircled forces, transmitted his situation report on November 24th. Army has sufficient ammunition for 6 days of combat, fuel for limited maneuvers, and food for approximately 9 days. Luftwaffe supply flights insufficient to maintain force. Soviet forces tightening encirclement. Without relief or breakout authorization, Army faces destruction. The Luftwaffe's supply effort revealed another uncomfortable truth. Göring had promised 500 tons daily. In the best weather conditions, Luftwaffe transport aircraft delivered 289 tons. In typical winter conditions with Soviet fighters harassing supply routes, deliveries averaged 94 tons daily. This meant 6th Army was slowly starving while being ground down by Soviet attacks. December 1942 brought a desperate attempt to rescue the encircled forces. Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group, Dawn launched Operation Winter Storm, a relief operation aimed at breaking through Soviet lines and opening a corridor to 6th Army. The operation revealed yet another miscalculation about Soviet strength. Manstein's attack forces included 4th Panzer Army reinforced with elite units. German doctrine held that a properly executed armored assault could penetrate any Soviet defense. The attack began December 12th with initial success. German tanks advanced 50 kilometers in 4 days, coming within 48 kilometers of 6th Army's perimeter. Then Soviet reserves German intelligence had assessed didn't exist, counterattacked with fresh tank armies. The 2nd Guards Army, equipped with hundreds of new T-34s and commanded by General Rodion Malinovsky, hit 4th Panzer Army's flanks with such force that Manstein's offensive stalled completely. Manstein transmitted his assessment to Hitler on December 19th. The message marked with a personal notation: relief impossible with available forces. Recommend immediate authorization for 6th Army breakout while winter storm creates window. Breakout must begin within 48 hours or window closes permanently. Hitler's response came within 3 hours. 6th Army will hold positions. Fortress Stalingrad anchors entire southern front. Paulus will maintain defense until relief achieved. That evening, Manstein held a conference with his senior commanders that would be recorded by multiple witnesses and later examined at Nuremberg trials. His words captured what many German commanders had begun to realize, but few would yet say openly. Gentlemen, we are not fighting the enemy we prepared to fight. Soviet forces are not collapsing under pressure. They are not making the mistakes we anticipated. They are not running out of men, tanks, or ammunition. Instead, they appear to be getting stronger while we grow weaker. This is not the Red Army of 1941. Something has changed, and we have failed to recognize it. Colonel Theodor Busse, Manstein's chief of operations, added the strategic context. The Soviet Union has a population of 190 million people, Herr Feldmarschall. Germany has 80 million. Even if we maintain 3-to-1 casualty ratios, the mathematics favor them. And we're no longer maintaining 3-to-1 ratios. At Stalingrad, we're sustaining equal or higher casualties than Soviet forces. This was the calculation that would haunt German strategic planning for the rest of the war. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with vastly greater reserves of manpower. As long as the Soviet Union maintained cohesion and continued fighting, time and mathematics favored them regardless of tactical German superiority. Captain Galen's intelligence summary from December 20th provided the most devastating assessment yet. His staff had spent weeks analyzing prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and force deployments. The conclusions shattered every remaining illusion about Soviet capacity. Soviet tank production in 1942 exceeded 24,000 vehicles. German tank production in the same period was 9,300. Soviet aircraft production exceeded 25,000 machines. German production was 15,400. Soviet artillery production exceeded 356,000 pieces. German production was 62,000 tons. But the most damning statistic involved something more fundamental than weapons: Soviet industrial evacuation. In late 1941, as German forces advanced, the Soviet Union had evacuated over 1,500 major factories from threatened areas to the Urals and Siberia. These factories, reassembled and operational by mid-1942, were producing weapons at rates German intelligence had deemed impossible. The implication, Galen explained to Zeitzler in a private briefing, is that Soviet industrial capacity not only survived our initial offensive, but is now exceeding our production in every major category. They are outproducing us while simultaneously fighting us. The longer this war continues, the stronger they become relative to our position. Zeitzler absorbed this in silence, then asked the question that would define German strategic thinking going forward. How long have we known this? Our intelligence services reported Soviet factory evacuations in real time during 1941, Galen admitted. We documented their industrial expansion, but the assessments were dismissed because they contradicted strategic planning assumptions. We chose to believe the Soviets were on the verge of collapse because admitting otherwise would require acknowledging that Operation Barbarossa was based on false premises. This admission that German intelligence had reported accurate information that was systematically ignored revealed the deepest problem. It wasn't that Germany lacked information about Soviet strength. It was that German leadership had created a decision-making environment where uncomfortable truths were dismissed as defeatism, where tactical victories were interpreted as proof of strategic success, and where ideology overruled analysis. By December 31, 1942, the situation at Stalingrad had deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. The Luftwaffe's supply effort had collapsed under winter storms and Soviet fighter attacks. German transport losses averaged 50 aircraft weekly, losses that couldn't be sustained. Supply deliveries had fallen to 60 tons daily, 1/8 of minimum requirements. Sixth Army's New Year Situation Report made devastating reading. Daily calorie intake per soldier had fallen to 800, 1/3 of minimum combat requirements. Frost injuries exceeded 10,000 cases, with inadequate medical supplies to treat them. Ammunition stocks sufficient for 2 days of heavy combat. Fuel reserves sufficient for less than 10 kilometers of vehicle movement. But what made this report different from previous assessments was its frank acknowledgement of reality. General Paulus, who had spent 2 months optimistically reporting that his forces could hold until relieved, now wrote with brutal honesty, "Army is in final stages of combat effectiveness. Soldiers are starving. Wounded are dying from lack of medical care. Soviet attacks are intensifying daily, while our defensive capacity diminishes hourly. There is no prospect of relief. There is no prospect of supply improvement. What remains is only the question of how long. Starvation and cold will take to accomplish what Soviet forces have not yet achieved through combat." This message reached Hitler on January 2, 1943. His response the same day demonstrated the psychological disconnect that had opened between Hitler and his commanders. Sixth Army will continue resistance. Every day Stalingrad holds ties down Soviet forces and prevents their use elsewhere. The Army's sacrifice ensures the survival of the rest of the front. This was the final transformation of the Stalingrad disaster. From military objective to sacrificial gesture, Sixth Army was no longer fighting to achieve victory or even to survive. It was fighting to die slowly enough that its death served some larger strategic purpose. Whether that purpose existed was increasingly doubtful. January 1943 brought intelligence reports that shook German High Command's understanding of the war even more fundamentally than the Stalingrad encirclement. Soviet forces launched new offensives across the entire southern front, operations clearly aimed at destroying not just Sixth Army, but the entire German position in southern Russia. Operation Little Saturn, launched January 16th, aimed to destroy Italian and Hungarian armies west of Stalingrad. Within 3 days, 3 Axis armies had disintegrated, leaving a 200-kilometer gap in the German front. Soviet mobile forces poured through, racing westward toward Rostov, the critical supply hub for all German forces in the Caucasus. Captain Galen's emergency assessment on January 18th provided context that changed everything. The Soviets are not conducting isolated operations. They are executing a theater-wide strategic offensive aimed at destroying Army Group South entirely. They have committed at least 40 armies, perhaps 2,000 men, to operations that display strategic planning capabilities we have consistently denied they possessed. Mein General, we are not facing a military that is on the verge of collapse. We are facing a military that is transitioning from defense to strategic offense while maintaining operational reserves we cannot match. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding the desperate retreat of German forces from the Caucasus, transmitted his strategic assessment on January 20th. The message, marked for Hitler's personal attention, represented the first time a German field. Marshall formally acknowledged that the war in the East could not be won through current strategy. Continued. Operations on current frontage impossible with available forces. Soviet numerical superiority in manpower, tanks, and artillery exceeds our capacity to maintain defensive lines. Request authorization for strategic withdrawal to defensible positions on Dnieper River. Alternative is continued attrition that will destroy Army Group South by spring. Hitler's response rejected the withdrawal request, but revealed something significant. For the first time, he acknowledged that the war in the East had become what he had always insisted it wouldn't: a war of attrition that Germany was losing. Withdrawal would surrender territory and resources we cannot afford to lose. But I acknowledge that current Soviet strength exceeds previous assessments. The question is not how to achieve victory through offensive operations, but how to maintain defensive positions until Soviet strength is exhausted. This subtle shift from planning victory to hoping for Soviet exhaustion marked the psychological turning point for German leadership. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting not to lose, hoping that somehow Soviet strength would collapse before German resources were depleted. January 31, 1943, brought the end. Soviet forces completed their reduction of the Stalingrad pocket. Field Marshal Paulus, promoted to that rank by Hitler specifically to prevent his surrender, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered with the southern group of forces. The northern group surrendered February 2nd. Approximately 91,000 German and Axis soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Less than 6,000 would return home after the war. The final tally of the Stalingrad disaster provided numbers that would force German high command to completely revise their understanding of the war. 6th Army and associated forces, approximately 290,000 men, destroyed. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, approximately 200,000 men, destroyed. Italian 8th Army, approximately 220,000 men, destroyed. Hungarian 2nd Army, approximately 200,000 men, destroyed. In less than 3 months, Axis forces had lost nearly 1 million men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft. But more devastating than the material losses was what the defeat revealed about German strategic assumptions. End of Part 1. What German High Command said when they realized the Eastern Front was lost. Part 2. The Reckoning, February 3rd, 1943, the day after 6th Army's final surrender at Stalingrad. The morning intelligence briefing at Führer headquarters took place in near silence. Officers who normally arrived with confident assessments and optimistic projections now carried reports that read like autopsies of German strategic thinking. Captain Reinhard Galen's overnight analysis represented not just an intelligence summary, but an admission of systematic failure. His document, later recovered from German military archives, bore a title that would have been considered defeatist heresy weeks earlier: Reassessment of Soviet Strategic Capability and Implications. For continued operations, the year opening paragraph dispensed with the careful language that had characterized previous German intelligence assessments. Previous estimates of Soviet military capacity, industrial production, and strategic planning capability were fundamentally incorrect. The Soviet Union possesses greater manpower reserves, industrial capacity, and operational sophistication than German intelligence assessed at any point since June 1941. The implications for continued operations in the East require immediate strategic revision at the highest levels. General Kurt Seitzler read this assessment to Hitler and the assembled staff at 0900 hours. The Führer's reaction revealed how completely the psychological foundation of German strategy had shifted. There was no explosion of rage, no accusations of defeatism, no confident assertions that German will would prevail. Instead, Hitler asked a single question: if they are this strong, why haven't they destroyed us already? It was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel who provided the answer that would define German strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. Because, mein Führer, they are not yet strong enough to destroy us everywhere simultaneously. They can achieve local superiority and win local victories, but their logistics, their command structure, and their experience cannot yet support the kind of theater-wide offensive that would collapse our entire front. They are learning to wage modern war while fighting us. The question is whether they will master it before we exhaust our capacity to resist. This was the new German strategic calculation. Not, can we defeat the Soviet Union, but can we hold defensive positions long enough for Soviet offensive capability to exhaust itself, or for political factors to intervene? The psychological shift from offensive confidence to defensive hope marked the complete reversal of German strategic thinking. Captain Galen's full intelligence assessment, delivered in a closed session with senior commanders on February 5th, provided the detailed numbers that justified this new calculation. What he presented was not merely a revision of previous estimates, but a complete reconstruction of German understanding about who they had been. Fighting Soviet manpower mobilization had exceeded every German projection. From June 1941 to January 1943, Soviet forces had sustained approximately 11,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. German intelligence had assessed that losses on this scale would break Soviet resistance. Instead, the Red Army maintained approximately 6,500 men under arms. The Soviets had absorbed catastrophic losses and replaced them with new formations faster than German forces could destroy them. The implication, Galen explained, is that Soviet population reserves vastly exceed our capacity to inflict casualties. Even if we maintain favorable casualty ratios, which we are no longer consistently achieving, the mathematics of attrition favor them. They can trade lives for time, and time allows their industrial capacity to mature. Soviet industrial production figures, assembled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance, revealed the scale of German miscalculation. In 1942, while fighting the largest land war in history, the Soviet Union had produced 146 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany produced 9,300 on 25,436 aircraft. Germany produced 15,409 356,000 artillery pieces. Germany produced 62,449,000 rifles. Germany produced $1,370,000, but production numbers alone didn't capture the full picture. What shook German commanders was the realization that Soviet production was accelerating, not declining. The factories evacuated to the Urals in 1941 were now operating at full capacity. New production facilities were opening monthly. Soviet output in the first quarter of 1943 was projected to exceed the entire 1941 production. "They are outbuilding us," Colonel Theodore Busse summarized, "while simultaneously fighting us. The longer this war continues, the greater their material advantage becomes. We cannot win. A production race against an enemy with 3 times our industrial workforce and effectively unlimited raw materials." Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose brilliant mobile defense had prevented complete collapse of Army Group South after Stalingrad, provided the operational assessment that connected industrial capacity to battlefield reality. His analysis, delivered on February 10th, represented the first formal acknowledgement from a serving field marshal that Germany could not achieve victory in the East. German forces can still achieve local tactical victories through superior operational skill. But strategic victory, defined as destroying Soviet capacity for continued resistance, is no longer achievable with available forces. Soviet numerical superiority in manpower, tanks, and artillery has reached levels where German tactical excellence can delay but not prevent Soviet operational success. We face a fundamental choice: attempt to hold current positions and be destroyed piecemeal, or conduct strategic withdrawal to defensible lines and accept the loss of territory and resources. This assessment reached Hitler on February 12, 1943, exactly 1 year after Hitler had issued Directive 41, ordering the summer offensive that would culminate in Stalingrad. His response to Manstein's report revealed how fundamentally his own understanding had changed. Strategic withdrawal surrenders the resources: Ukrainian grain, Donetsk coal, Caucasus oil, that make continued resistance possible. But Field Marshal von Manstein is correct that we cannot hold every position. The question is not whether to trade space for time, but how to conduct that trade without triggering complete collapse. For the first time since the invasion began, Hitler acknowledged that Germany was fighting not to achieve objectives, but to avoid catastrophe. The psychological impact of this admission rippled through every level of German command. The February 18th conference at Führer headquarters brought together the senior commanders who would shape German strategy for the remainder of the war. Present were Field Marshal von Manstein, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, Army Group Center, WWII, Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, Army Group North. General Zeitzler, and Colonel General Jodl. The topic was officially listed as Strategic Options for Spring 1943. The Rehert's actual discussion became a comprehensive examination of how German leadership had so completely misunderstood the war they were fighting. Von Manstein, normally circumspect about directly challenging leadership decisions, spoke with remarkable candor. "We invaded the Soviet Union believing 3 things: that Soviet leadership was incompetent, that Soviet industrial capacity was primitive, and that Soviet society would fracture under military pressure. All 3 beliefs were wrong. The question we must now answer is how we could have been so systematically incorrect about an enemy we had studied for decades." General Zeitzler provided part of the answer. "We studied the Soviet Union through the lens of our own assumptions. We saw their 1937 purges and concluded their officer corps was destroyed. We failed to recognize that Stalin was promoting younger, more competent officers to replace the purged leadership. We saw their industrial statistics and concluded their economy was inefficient. We failed to recognize that inefficiency in peacetime production masks genuine capacity for wartime mobilization. We saw their political system and concluded it was brittle. We failed to recognize that authoritarianism, whatever its moral failures, can achieve social mobilization that democracies struggle to match." Captain Galen added the intelligence perspective. "But we also ignored our own reporting. Our intelligence services documented Soviet industrial evacuation in 1941. We reported on their tank production increases. We identified new Soviet armies forming in the rear. Every report was dismissed because it contradicted the strategic premise that the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. We created an information environment where accurate reporting was treated as defeatism. This admission that German intelligence had repeatedly provided accurate information that was systematically ignored represented the most damning indictment of German strategic decision-making. The failure wasn't insufficient intelligence. It was the refusal to accept intelligence that contradicted comfortable assumptions. Field Marshal von Kluge raised the question that haunted every German commander. If we recognized in late 1941 that Soviet resistance was stronger than expected, why did we continue offensive operations in 1942? Why Stalingrad? The silence that followed this question lasted nearly a minute. Every officer present understood the answer, but none wanted to speak it aloud. It was Colonel General Jodl who finally articulated what everyone knew. Because, admitting that we couldn't defeat the Soviet Union militarily required acknowledging that Operation Barbarossa was a strategic error, and acknowledging that error would undermine the entire political and ideological foundation of the regime. We continued offensive operations not because we believed they would achieve decisive victory, but because we couldn't afford to admit they wouldn't. This was the psychological trap that had doomed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers at Stalingrad. The refusal to retreat wasn't based on military calculation, but on the political and psychological impossibility of admitting that German forces could be defeated by an enemy the regime had spent years portraying as racially and culturally inferior. The spring of 1943 brought additional intelligence that reinforced the new German understanding. Soviet forces, rather than exhausting themselves in winter offensives, were conducting systematic withdrawals to defensible positions, demonstrating operational sophistication that German doctrine had insisted they lacked. The most troubling development involved Soviet tank production and design. German intelligence had documented the T-34 medium tank since its appearance in 1941, acknowledging it as superior to contemporary German designs. But German commanders had consoled themselves that superior German tactics would overcome Soviet equipment advantages. By March 1943, Soviet tank production had reached levels that made tactical superiority irrelevant. The Red Army was fielding tank corps, 200 to 300 tanks per formation, in numbers that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer mass. More troubling, Soviet crews were improving rapidly, learning from experience and adopting German tactical innovations. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, recalled from disgrace to oversee German panzer forces, provided an assessment that shocked even hardened commanders. The Soviets are producing T-34s at approximately 200 per month. We are producing all tank types at approximately 600 per month, and many of these are lighter models unsuited for Eastern Front combat. The Soviets can absorb tank losses we cannot replace. In any extended engagement, numerical superiority will prevail regardless of tactical skill. The implications of this calculation were devastating. Germany's entire military doctrine was built on the premise that tactical and operational excellence could overcome numerical disadvantages. If Soviet numbers had reached levels where tactical skill became irrelevant, then German forces were fighting a war they couldn't win. April 1943 brought planning for Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive. The operation represented one final attempt to reclaim strategic initiative through a decisive offensive. But the planning discussions revealed how completely German strategic thinking had changed. Field Marshal von Manstein advocated for the operation, arguing that German forces could still achieve tactical victories that would bleed Soviet reserves and delay their offensive capability. But his justification revealed the transformed strategic landscape. We cannot achieve decisive victory through Citadel, but we can inflict casualties that postpone Soviet offensives and buy time for political developments to intervene. This was strategy driven by hope rather than calculation. German commanders were no longer planning to win the war. They were planning to not lose it long enough for something. Political change in the Soviet Union, Allied Soviet tensions, technological breakthrough, to change the strategic equation. General Zeitzler opposed Citadel on grounds that revealed the new German understanding. The Soviets know we are coming. Their intelligence services have penetrated our planning. They are fortifying the Kursk salient with defenses that will bleed our panzer forces. We will attack into prepared defenses against an enemy that can replace losses faster than we can. Even if we achieve local tactical success, we will weaken ourselves strategically. The Kursk offensive, launched in July 1943, would prove Zeitzler correct. German forces would achieve some tactical successes, but at costs that couldn't be sustained. More significantly, Soviet forces would demonstrate defensive sophistication, defense in depth, mobile reserves, coordinated counterattacks that shattered any remaining German illusions about Soviet operational capability. But before Kursk, German leadership conducted an assessment that would be preserved in military archives as one of the most brutally honest analyses produced during the war. Requested by Hitler himself in May 1943, the document was titled Strategic Assessment: Prospects for Achieving Acceptable Peace Settlement in the East. The assessment's conclusions were remarkable for their frankness. Germany cannot achieve military victory over the Soviet Union. Soviet numerical superiority in manpower, industrial capacity, and material resources exceeds German capacity for sustained offensive operations. Defensive operations can delay but not prevent Soviet advance. Prospects for favorable peace settlement depend on factors beyond German military control. Deterioration of Allied coalition, Soviet political instability, or Allied unwillingness to accept Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Military strategy must aim to maintain defensible positions long enough for these factors to potentially intervene. This assessment, delivered to Hitler on May 15, 1943, represented the formal acknowledgement that the war in the East could not be won. What followed would be attempts to not lose catastrophically enough to survive until political factors intervened. It was strategy driven by desperation rather than hope for victory. The summer of 1943 brought additional revelations that reinforced German commanders' new understanding. The Battle of Kursk, July 5-16, demonstrated that Soviet forces could not only defend successfully, but could transition seamlessly from defense to offensive operations that recaptured German gains and continued advancing westward. What shook German commanders wasn't just that the Soviets had stopped the German offensive. It was how they had done it. Soviet forces had created defensive zones 30 to 40 kilometers deep, with multiple defensive lines, prepared artillery positions, minefields, and mobile reserves positioned to counterattack any German penetration. This wasn't the desperate, improvised defense of 1941. This was sophisticated operational-level defense that demonstrated mastery of modern combined arms warfare. Field Marshal von Manstein's post-Kursk assessment, delivered August 1, 1943, marked a watershed in German military thinking. We are no longer fighting the Red Army of 1941. We are fighting a military force that has learned from its defeats, that has adapted our tactical innovations, that has developed operational capabilities matching our own. Soviet forces are now capable of conducting offensive operations with coordination and sophistication that equals German planning. Combined with their numerical superiority, this represents a strategic problem we cannot solve through available means. Captain Galen's intelligence assessment from August 15th provided the detailed analysis supporting Manstein's conclusion. Soviet officer quality had improved dramatically. Younger commanders promoted after the purges, Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, Chuikov, had learned modern warfare through experience and demonstrated operational skill comparable to German commanders. Soviet staff work had evolved from crude in 1941 to sophisticated in 1943. Soviet logistics, while still inferior to German standards, had improved sufficiently to support sustained offensive operations. Most troubling, Soviet forces had captured enough German equipment, studied enough German tactical manuals, and interrogated enough German prisoners that they understood German doctrine thoroughly. They were adapting German operational concepts, combined arms warfare, mobile defense, operational depth, while maintaining the Soviet advantages of numerical superiority and strategic reserves. The implication, Galen explained in a closed briefing with senior commanders, is that we have trained our enemy. Soviet forces in 1943 fight like German forces in 1941, but with 3 times the numbers and 5 times the industrial production. We face a version of ourselves that can absorb casualties we cannot replace and sustain offensives we cannot counter. The autumn of 1943 brought the complete collapse of German positions in southern Russia. Soviet forces liberated Kharkov in August, reached the Dnieper River in September, and crossed it in October. The defensive line Hitler had insisted must be held, the eastern wall along the Dnieper, was breached before German forces could properly fortify it. Field Marshal von Manstein, conducting a brilliant but ultimately futile mobile defense, transmitted assessments throughout this period that chronicled the breakdown of German defensive strategy. His message from October 20th captured the essential problem. Soviet forces attack with such numerical superiority that local defensive successes become irrelevant. We destroy a Soviet tank corps, and 2 more appear behind it. We repel an attack by 3 Soviet armies, and 5 more armies attack elsewhere. We cannot be strong everywhere, and the Soviets exploit every weakness with fresh forces we cannot match. This is not a war of tactical skill. This is a war of arithmetic, and the mathematics favor them overwhelmingly. November 1943 brought liberation of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and the largest city Germany had captured in 1941. The loss carried psychological weight beyond its military significance. If German forces couldn't hold Kiev, fortified, defended by veteran troops, supported by extensive supply lines, what could they hold? The final intelligence assessment of 1943, delivered by Captain Galen on December 15th, provided a comprehensive analysis of how completely German strategic understanding had transformed since Stalingrad. The document's conclusions were remarkable. Soviet military capability has evolved from crude quantity to sophisticated quality maintained at quantitative scale we cannot match. Soviet industrial production exceeds German production in every major weapons category. Soviet force mobilization continues to expand even as German reserves approach exhaustion. Soviet operational planning now demonstrates sophistication equal to German standards, while executed with numerical superiority we cannot counter. Prospects for German defensive. Success depend not on defeating Soviet offensives, but on delaying them long enough for political or strategic factors beyond military control to intervene. This assessment circulated among senior German commanders throughout December. 1943, Field Marshal von Manstein's handwritten notes on his copy, preserved in archives, captured what many German commanders understood but could not say publicly. We lost this war at Stalingrad, not because of the battle itself, but because Stalingrad forced us to recognize what we had refused to acknowledge, that we invaded the Soviet Union based on comfortable lies about Soviet weakness, rather than uncomfortable truths about Soviet strength. Every decision since has been attempts to avoid admitting this fundamental error. But military reality cannot be avoided forever. We are losing because we attacked an enemy we never understood, and by the time we finally understood them, it was too late to do anything but lose slowly rather than quickly. The winter of 1943–44 brought Soviet offensives that systematically destroyed German defensive positions across the entire Eastern Front. Army Group North was pushed back from Leningrad. Army Group Center faced massive encirclements in Belarus. Army Group South retreated westward toward the 1939 borders, fighting desperately to prevent complete collapse. The WWII intelligence briefings during this period documented the scale of Soviet offensive capability with numbers that would have seemed impossible. In 1941, Soviet forces conducted simultaneous offensive operations across fronts spanning 1,200 miles. They committed 7 million men, 5,000 tanks, and 15,000 aircraft to winter operations. They sustained logistics for these forces across hundreds of miles of captured territory. General Zeitzler's assessment from January 1944 acknowledged what had become obvious. The Soviet Union is conducting offensive operations at operational and strategic scale that exceeds anything German forces achieved in 1941 to 42. They have learned to wage modern war while fighting us, and they have reached a level of sophistication that, combined with their numerical superiority, makes defensive success increasingly difficult to achieve. February 1944 brought additional humiliation. Soviet forces encircled and destroyed 60,000 German and Axis troops in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, a miniature Stalingrad that demonstrated the Soviets could execute the kind of operational-level encirclements that German forces had pioneered. The psychological impact of watching Soviet forces execute German operational concepts against German troops was devastating for commanders who had built careers on German tactical superiority. Field Marshal von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, provided an assessment that captured the complete reversal of German understanding. We began this war believing Soviet forces would collapse under pressure because their system was brittle, their leadership was incompetent, and their soldiers lacked fighting spirit. We are ending it facing a military that has not only absorbed catastrophic losses, but has become more capable with each year of war. They have demonstrated that authoritarian systems, however morally reprehensible, can achieve military mobilization and industrial coordination that our system cannot match. We are fighting a version of total war that we invented in theory, but they have implemented in practice. The spring of 1944 brought planning for Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive that would destroy Army Group Center completely. German intelligence detected Soviet preparations, but could do nothing to prevent them. The forces necessary to defend against the coming offensive simply didn't exist. Captain Galen's final pre-Bagration assessment, delivered June 1, 1944, provided the most complete analysis yet of how Soviet military capability had evolved. Soviet forces in June 1944 bear no resemblance to Soviet forces in June 1941. They possess operational sophistication, tactical flexibility, logistical capability, and numerical superiority that makes defensive success improbable absent Soviet errors that they no longer consistently make. German forces can still achieve local tactical victories, but these victories do not alter strategic trajectory. The question is no longer whether Germany can win this war. The question is whether Germany can delay defeat long enough to avoid complete destruction. Operation Bagration, launched June 23, 1944, demonstrated the complete transformation of Soviet capability. Over 3 weeks, Soviet forces destroyed Army Group Center, 28 divisions, approximately 400,000 men, in the most catastrophic German defeat of the entire war. The Soviet operation demonstrated mastery of operational art, deception operations, concentration of force, breakthrough operations, exploitation, encirclement, and systematic destruction of pocketed forces. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, transmitted his final report before being captured by Soviet forces. We are not being defeated by crude Soviet mass attacks. We are being defeated by sophisticated operational planning executed with overwhelming force. The Soviets have become what we claim to be, masters of modern combined arms warfare. The difference is They can sustain it with numerical superiority we cannot match. The summer of 1944 brought the complete collapse of German positions in the east. Soviet forces liberated Belarus, entered Poland, reached the Baltic states, and approached East Prussia, German homeland territory. The defensive positions Hitler had insisted must be held were overrun. The resources, Ukrainian grain, Romanian oil, that were supposed to make continued resistance possible were lost. The strategic calculation that Germany could trade space for time had failed because Germany ran out of space before the Soviets ran out of time. By August 1944, German commanders who had survived since 1941 conducted informal assessments of what had gone wrong. These conversations, recorded in war diaries and post-war memoirs, revealed the psychological journey from confidence to catastrophe. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most skilled defensive commanders, summarized the evolution. In 1941, we thought we were fighting a primitive enemy that would collapse quickly. In 1942, we thought we were fighting an incompetent enemy that we could defeat through superior skill. In 1943, we realized we were fighting a learning enemy that was improving faster than we anticipated. In 1944, we understood we were fighting an enemy that had become more capable than us while maintaining numerical superiority we could never match. We lost because we spent 3 years fighting the enemy we wanted to exist, rather than the enemy that actually existed. Field Marshal von Manstein, removed from command in April 1944 after repeated disagreements with Hitler, provided his final assessment in conversations with fellow officers. We invaded the Soviet Union believing 3 lies: that Soviet industry was primitive, that Soviet leadership was incompetent, and that Soviet society would fracture under pressure. Each lie was comfortable because believing it made victory seem possible. When reality demolished these lies, we could have revised our strategy. Instead, we reinterpreted setbacks to preserve the lies because admitting we were wrong required acknowledging that we couldn't win. Stalingrad forced us to confront reality. But by then, it was too late to do anything but lose slowly, rather than quickly. The final year of the war brought additional revelations about Soviet capability that would shock German commanders who had spent years underestimating their enemy. Soviet forces demonstrated they could conduct offensive operations in winter, spring, summer, and fall. Continuous pressure that prevented German forces from establishing defensive positions. They demonstrated they could coordinate operations across multiple fronts, spanning thousands of miles. They demonstrated they could sustain logistics for millions of soldiers while simultaneously rebuilding destroyed territory. Most humbling, Soviet forces demonstrated industrial capacity that dwarfed German production despite 4 years of total war. In 1944, while fighting continuous defensive battles across 2 fronts, Germany produced 17,000 tanks. The Soviet Union, while conducting massive offensives, produced 29,000. The Soviets built more tanks during the war than all other combatants combined, while simultaneously producing aircraft, artillery, trucks, and ammunition at scales German industry couldn't match. Captain Galen's final wartime intelligence assessment, compiled in March 1945 as Soviet forces closed on Berlin, provided comprehensive analysis of what German intelligence had failed to understand. The Soviet Union demonstrated capacity for total war mobilization that exceeded all German projections. They evacuated and relocated entire industries under combat conditions. They mobilized human resources we assessed as unavailable. They developed operational capabilities we insisted they couldn't achieve. They sustained logistics for multi-million-man armies across distances we claimed were impossible. They outproduced us in every category while simultaneously fighting us. We failed to understand them not because information was unavailable, but because understanding them required acknowledging that we had started a war we couldn't win. By the time we finally understood our enemy, we lacked resources to do anything with that understanding except document our errors, for whatever comes after. The final collapse came in April-May 1945. Soviet forces entered Berlin, fighting house to house against German defenders, who had nowhere to retreat. The operational sophistication that Soviet forces demonstrated, urban warfare tactics, combined arms coordination, systematic reduction of defensive positions, bore no resemblance to the crude Red Army that German forces had faced in 1941. General Helmuth Weidling, final defender of Berlin, provided the last official assessment of Soviet military capability in his surrender negotiations on May 2nd. "We are surrendering not to the Red Army we invaded in 1941, but to a military force that has evolved into one of history's most effective fighting organizations. They learned modern warfare while fighting us, and they became better at it than we ever were because they combined operational sophistication with quantitative superiority we could never match. We lost because we refused to recognize what we were fighting until it was too late to matter." The post-war testimonies of German commanders, collected by Allied interrogators and historians, revealed the psychological journey from confident superiority to bitter recognition. The pattern was consistent. Initial confidence that German skill would overcome Soviet numbers, gradual realization that Soviet numbers were backed by improving skill, final acknowledgement that Soviet forces had evolved into a military machine more effective than Germany's. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, one of the last German commanders still fighting in May 1945, provided testimony that captured the complete reversal of German military understanding. "We invaded the Soviet Union believing we were fighting an inferior enemy. We ended the war understanding that we had attacked a sleeping giant that, once awakened, possessed capabilities we couldn't match. The Soviet Union absorbed casualties that would have destroyed any other nation and emerged stronger. They endured material losses that should have broken any economy and produced more weapons. They suffered defeats that should have collapsed any government and maintained political cohesion. We assumed they were weak because they were communist. We learned too late that communism, whatever its moral failures, enabled total war mobilization that our system couldn't achieve." The final reckoning came in 1946-47, when American occupation authorities provided German commanders with comprehensive data about Soviet war production and capability. The numbers confirmed what German commanders had realized too late. The Soviet Union had conducted total war at a scale and intensity that exceeded German capacity from the beginning. Soviet war production totals, compiled from Soviet archives, tanks and self-propelled guns, $105,000. Germany, 46,000. Aircraft, 157,000. Germany, 90,000. Artillery, 516,000. Germany, 175,000. Mortars, 351,000. Germany, 68,000. Machine guns, 1,477,000. Germany, $674,000. But production numbers alone didn't capture the full picture. The Soviets had sustained this production while evacuating industries, losing major cities, and fighting continuous defensive and offensive operations. They had mobilized 34 million people into military service during the war, more than the entire German population of military age. They had replaced catastrophic casualties and maintained armies in the field that outnumbered German forces throughout the war. General Franz Halder, former Army Chief of Staff, recorded his final assessment in 1949 while imprisoned for war crimes. "We lost the war in the East for one simple reason. We never understood our enemy. We assumed they thought as we thought, that their society functioned as ours functioned, that their limits matched our limits. Every one of these assumptions was wrong. Soviet society functioned through mechanisms we found ideologically repugnant but practically effective. Soviet leadership made decisions we found strategically questionable but operationally sound. Soviet forces absorbed losses we found strategically catastrophic but operationally sustainable. By the time we understood that we were fighting an enemy that operated according to different rules and different mathematics, we had committed forces we couldn't sustain to objectives we couldn't achieve. Stalingrad didn't make us lose the war. Stalingrad made us recognize we had already lost it. The final lesson absorbed by German military leadership was perhaps the most bitter. The Soviet Union had won not despite suffering greater casualties and destruction, but because they possessed the capacity to sustain casualties and destruction that would have broken Germany. Total war wasn't about who fought more skillfully or who possessed better weapons. Total war was about who could mobilize resources most completely and sustain losses most ruthlessly. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, in his post-war memoirs, captured what Stalingrad had finally forced German leadership to acknowledge. We invaded the Soviet Union believing that military skill could overcome material disadvantage. We lost because the Soviets possessed both material advantage and developing military skill that eventually matched and exceeded our own. The atomic bomb didn't end the war in the East. The war in the East ended because German forces were systematically destroyed by an enemy we had spent 4 years underestimating. Stalingrad was simply the moment we could no longer maintain the comfortable lies we had told ourselves. The Soviet Union was never on the verge of collapse. We were.